Thomas Whitfield was a 65-year-old farmer who was about to lose his family legacy to corporate developers after 40 years of secretly hosting a critical military research station on his fertile Montana land. His final eviction notice caught the attention of someone powerful, and 24 hours later, an Apache helicopter landed in his south pasture, changing his life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas stood motionless on his weathered porch, calloused, hands gripping the final eviction notice until the paper crinkled at the edges. His gaze swept across the rolling hills of Clearwater Farm, the land his grandfather had purchased in 1937, the soil his father had cultivated through drought and prosperity, the fields that had defined Thomas's entire existence. At 65, the prospect of starting over seemed not just daunting, but impossible. 4 decades of careful stewardship about to be erased with a corporate signature and a bank transfer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the western fields, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the storm brewing in Thomas's heart. The sharp wind carried the scent of approaching rain and the faint diesel smell from the developer's surveying equipment they'd left at the property boundary. A constant reminder of what was coming. "Thomas, your dinner's getting cold," Margaret called from inside, her voice carrying the same gentle patience it had for their 38 years of marriage. She knew better than to mention the notice directly. They'd exhausted the topic over the past 5 months, examining every legal angle, every potential escape route, only to arrive at the same dead end. He carefully folded the paper along creases, already worn from repeated handling, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "Coming," he replied, his voice rough with emotions he wouldn't let surface. Not yet. Not while there was still one final night on Clearwater Farm. What made Thomas's 830-acre property truly extraordinary wasn't visible to casual observers. Beneath the rich soil of the south pasture lay a rare geological formation that created the perfect conditions for testing advanced military communications technology. The unique mineral composition acted as a natural signal shield, allowing researchers to develop systems that could maintain clear transmissions even under the most hostile electronic interference, capabilities that had saved countless American soldiers' lives across multiple conflicts. As Thomas settled into his usual place at the kitchen table, his eyes drifted to the wall, covered with photographs chronicling 3 generations of Whitfields. Among family portraits and harvest celebrations were more unusual images. Thomas's grandfather shaking hands with serious-looking men in 1950s military uniforms. His father receiving a certificate from a 4-star general in 1972. Thomas himself standing beside various officers over the decades, the classified equipment visible in the background becoming progressively more sophisticated. "They're offering above market value," Margaret said softly, placing a plate of pot roast in front of him, his favorite meal, a small comfort on this darkest of evenings. "We could get that small place near Jason and the grandkids in Colorado. Being closer to family wouldn't be so bad." Thomas nodded absently. They'd had this conversation so many times the words seemed to play themselves, like a record stuck in a groove. "I know, Maggie. It's not about the money, you know that." She sat across from him, reaching for his weathered hand. "I know, but maybe it's time. Your father passed the torch to you, and you've carried it faithfully. No one would blame you." For what?" Thomas withdrew his hand, immediately regretting his sharp tone. For giving up, for selling out. Thomas, I'm sorry, he sighed heavily. It's just, nobody driving past would know that this unassuming farm has been crucial to developing communication systems that kept soldiers connected in the mountains of Afghanistan or the deserts of Iraq. Or that technological breakthroughs that saved. American lives were refined right here under our feet. Margaret nodded patiently. I understand, Thomas. I've been here right alongside you for all those middle-of-the-night tests, all those classified briefings in our living room, all those years of keeping secrets from our own neighbors. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, another Whitfield family heirloom that had witnessed decades of quiet service. Colonel James Peterson from nearby Fort Harrison had visited just last week, his usual confident demeanor replaced with genuine regret. We've exhausted every legal channel, Peterson had explained, seated at this very table. The geological properties of your south pasture are impossible to replicate artificially, at least with current technology. Without it, we're looking at setting back certain research programs by at least a decade. Thomas had nodded grimly. And the new testing site in Arizona? Still at least 3 years from operational status, Peterson had admitted. Your farm has been the perfect natural laboratory. The unique mineral composition creates shielding patterns that allow us to stress-test communication systems in ways we can't duplicate elsewhere. Now, as evening settled over the farm, Thomas reached for the folder Peterson had left behind. Inside were years of data, classified military assessments, and photographs documenting how Clearwater Farm had shaped modern battlefield communications. Most farmers could point to their crops, their livestock, their contribution to feeding America. Thomas could point to soldiers who maintained contact with their units in signal-dead zones because their equipment had been hardened against interference right here on his land. But tomorrow, the bulldozers would arrive. Ridge Inn Development Corporation had plans for a sprawling luxury resort complex with a golf course, and Thomas's farm stood directly in their path. Their CEO, Alexandra Camden, had personally visited last month, her tailored business suit and designer shoes looking absurdly out of place against the practical backdrop of Thomas's farmyard. Mr. Whitfield, I respect your family's history here, Camden had said with practiced sympathy, but you have to understand, progress doesn't wait for sentiment. What we're building will create hundreds of jobs and transform this sleepy region into a premier destination. Thomas had simply pointed to the south pasture. And what about what happens there? Isn't that progress too? Camden had smiled thinly. Military contracts come and go. What we're offering is permanence and considerably more profitable for the region's tax base. The conversation had ended there. No amount of explaining could make someone like Camden understand what couldn't be measured in quarterly profits or shareholder value. Thomas finished his dinner in silence, his mind turning to his father's words from decades ago. This land isn't just soil, Tommy. It's a resource for the nation. Remember that. He had remembered. For 40 years, he had maintained the South. Pasture kept its secrets, followed protocols that would seem bizarre to neighboring farmers. He'd turned down countless offers to sell, even when farming itself became less profitable year after year. But now, unless something changed in the next 24 hours, a crucial piece of America's military research infrastructure would be lost forever. The papers were signed, the legal battles lost. Westridge had won. "I should check the equipment one last time," Thomas said, rising from the table. Margaret didn't try to stop him. After 38 years of marriage, she knew when Thomas needed space. With his thoughts, the evening air had cooled considerably as Thomas walked the perimeter of the south pasture, checking connections and ensuring the protective casings were secured. The testing equipment sat innocuously, weather-resistant boxes housing sensitive devices that measured phenomena most people wouldn't understand. To the uninitiated, they looked like ordinary agricultural sensors. In the fading light, Thomas's mind turned to the first time he'd understood the true significance of Clearwater Farm. He was just 19 years old, home from his first year of agricultural college for the summer of 1975. His father, Robert Whitfield, had finally decided he was old enough to learn the family's other business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "There's more to farming this land than what they're teaching you in school," Robert had said that morning, leading Thomas to a nondescript shed near the south pasture. Inside, sophisticated equipment hummed quietly, monitoring devices Thomas had never seen before. "What is all this, Dad?" he'd asked, bewildered by the contradiction between the shed's rustic exterior and its high-tech contents. "This is why the Whitfield farm matters to more than just us," Robert had replied, carefully explaining how his own father had discovered the unusual properties of the south pasture during a geological survey in 1949. What might have been dismissed as a curious anomaly became invaluable when a visiting Army Corps engineer recognized its potential for military applications. Later that same day, a small convoy of military vehicles had arrived. Thomas watched in fascination as uniformed personnel set up additional equipment across the pasture. Major Harrison, the officer in charge, had studied Thomas thoughtfully before extending his hand. "Your family's farm has helped us develop communication systems that work when all others fail," Harrison had explained. "What looks like ordinary farmland to most people is actually one of the most valuable testing sites in the country." That day had changed everything for Thomas. While his college classmates dreamed of agricultural innovations or taking over their family farms, he began to see Clearwater differently, not just as a means of production, but as an essential, if invisible, link in America's defense technology. Now, 40 years later, Thomas took one last look at the pasture bathed in moonlight. Tomorrow would bring Alexandra Camden and her attorneys with their final paperwork. Tomorrow would mark the end of everything he had worked for his entire life. What Thomas couldn't know was that 300 miles away, in a secure command center, someone was reviewing a detailed report about exactly what would be lost when Clearwater Farm disappeared beneath Westridge's foundations, and making a decision that would change everything. As darkness settled completely over the farm, Thomas turned toward home, unaware that the secure satellite phone tucked in his office drawer had begun blinking with an incoming call from a direct line that hadn't been used in over a decade. The approaching storm finally broke as Thomas reached the porch, fat raindrops turning quickly to a downpour that matched his mood. Tomorrow would bring clear skies according to the forecast. Perfect weather for beginning demolition. Nature itself seemed determined to wash away the last vestiges of Clearwater Farm, cleansing the palate for Westridge's grand vision. Inside, Margaret had already gone up to bed, leaving a single lamp burning in the living room. Their son Jason had called earlier, Thomas had heard Margaret's one-sided conversation from the porch, checking in as he had every night since the legal battle was lost. Unlike Thomas, who had embraced the family legacy, Jason had chosen a different path, becoming an engineer in Denver. He understood his father's attachment to the land, but couldn't fully grasp its deeper significance. The classified nature of the military research meant that even family members could only be told so much. Thomas moved through the familiar rooms of the farmhouse, touching objects that held generations of memories: the oak banister his grandfather had carved by hand, the kitchen table where 3 generations of Whitfields had broken bread with military officers, the worn leather chair where his father had taught him to read. Tomorrow these would all belong to someone else. In the small office off the main hallway, Thomas noticed a blinking light he hadn't seen in years. The secure satellite phone, installed during a communication system upgrade in 2009, was indicating an incoming call. Only a handful of high-ranking military personnel had this number, and it hadn't been used since the previous generation of testing had concluded in 2012. Thomas picked up the receiver, his heart rate quickening despite his attempt to remain calm. "Whitfield here. Thomas, it's General Robert Andrews." The voice was instantly familiar, though Thomas hadn't spoken with Andrews in nearly 8 years. Once a colonel overseeing the communication testing program, Andrews had risen through the ranks to become one of the Pentagon's key technology strategists. "General, been a while." "Too long," Andrews agreed, his voice grave. "I know what's happening tomorrow. Peterson kept me informed." Thomas swallowed hard. "Then you know there's nothing left to do. We fought as long as we could." "That's why I'm calling, Thomas. I want you to know we haven't completely given up." A flicker of something, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin, stirred in Thomas's chest. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means keep that phone charged and nearby tomorrow. That's all I can say for now. Just be ready." The line went dead before Thomas could ask any more questions. He set the phone down on his desk and stared at it, uncertain what to make of the cryptic message. After months of being told that every possible avenue had been exhausted, every legal channel blocked, what could Andrews possibly have planned at this 11th hour? Thomas was still pondering this question when Margaret appeared in the doorway, her robe pulled tight against the night's chill. "Everything all right? I thought I heard voices." Thomas hesitated, not wanting to kindle false hope. "Just checking. A few things before tomorrow. Go back to bed. I'll be up soon." After she left, Thomas remained in his office, reviewing the events that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, Westridge Development had begun buying properties in the area, offering generous sums that most of his neighbors couldn't refuse. Thomas had initially dismissed their offers without a second thought. The Whitfield farm wasn't for sale at any price. Then the pressure had started. Veiled references to eminent domain, suggestions that the county might reassess property. Taxes, hints that water rights might be reviewed. When Thomas still wouldn't budge, Alexandra Camden had arrived personally to deliver what she called her final best offer, a sum so large it had momentarily made Thomas question his resolve. When he declined, Camden's pleasant facade had cracked. "Let me be clear, Mr. Whitfield," she'd said, her voice hardening. "Westridge will build our resort here. The only question is whether you benefit financially or fight a losing battle." The legal challenges had begun the following week. Somehow, problems that had never existed before suddenly materialized. Boundary disputes with properties Westridge had already acquired, questions about historical water usage, environmental concerns that appeared out of nowhere. Each required expensive legal responses, draining the farm's modest financial reserves with alarming speed. Colonel Peterson had tried to help, but the classified nature of the military's interest in the property made direct intervention impossible. "We can't exactly tell a judge that your farmhouse's critical defense testing capabilities," he'd explained, "not without creating bigger problems." 2 months ago, the final blow had come. The county commissioners had approved a zoning change that redesignated the entire area for commercial tourism development. Thomas's appeals had been denied, and the last court challenge had failed just 10 days ago. The eviction notice had arrived yesterday, giving them 48 hours to vacate, a courtesy extension from the standard 24 hours, Camden had noted in her accompanying letter. Thomas finally went upstairs, slipping quietly into bed beside Margaret. Despite his exhaustion, sleep remained elusive. General Andrews's cryptic message played repeatedly in his mind. What could possibly change now, with the legal avenues exhausted, and the bulldozers scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning? As the storm raged outside, Thomas finally drifted into troubled sleep, unaware that events had already been set in motion that would transform the next day into something none of them could have anticipated. Dawn broke over Clearwater Farm as it had for decades, casting the fields in soft golden light. But this dawn was different. This was the last morning the Whitfield family would wake up as owners of this land. Thomas rose before the sun. A habit, formed over a lifetime of farming. There would be no crops to tend today, no equipment to check. Most of the farm machinery had already been sold or moved to his cousin's property 30 miles away. What remained would be auctioned off by week's end. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Margaret. She deserved a few more minutes of peace. Before facing the day ahead, Thomas made his way to the kitchen, starting the coffee maker on autopilot. As the familiar aroma filled the room, he walked to the back door and looked out at the south pasture. From this distance, there was nothing remarkable about it. Just 10 acres of open land surrounded by what had once been productive wheat fields. But Thomas knew better. He knew what that unassuming patch of earth had contributed to national security over the years. The thought that it would soon be buried under concrete foundations and manicured golf greens made his chest tighten with grief he couldn't fully express. The coffee maker beeped, pulling Thomas from his reverie. He poured himself a cup and settled at the kitchen table just as the secure satellite phone in his office began blinking again. Thomas retrieved the phone and pressed the secure answer button. "Whitfield," he said simply. "Morning, Thomas," the voice on the other end responded. "General Andrews here. Didn't catch you last night. I was hoping you'd still be checking this line." "Force of habit," Thomas replied. 40 years of protocol doesn't disappear overnight. "That's precisely why I'm calling," Andrews said. "Men like you are rare these days, Thomas. People who understand that commitment means something beyond personal convenience." Thomas sipped his coffee, waiting. Andrews wasn't one for small talk. "I want you to know that what your family has done for this country won't be forgotten," the general continued. "The communication systems tested on your land have saved countless lives. Just last year, a special operations team in—" He paused. "Well, I can't say where, but they maintained contact through an electronic warfare zone that would have silenced any standard equipment. That was directly because of the countermeasures we developed at Clearwater." "Appreciate the sentiment, General," Thomas said, "but sentiment doesn't stop bulldozers." There was a pause on the line. "No, it doesn't," Andrews agreed. "But I didn't call just to reminisce. I called because I want you to know we haven't given up, not completely." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means keep that phone charged and nearby today," Andrews said. "That's all I can say for now. Just be ready." The line went dead before Thomas could ask any more questions. He set the phone down on the table and stared at it, uncertain what to make of the cryptic message. After months of being told that every possible avenue had been exhausted, Andrew's words offered a thread of something not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. Margaret appeared in the doorway, already dressed in practical jeans and a sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked older this morning, the weight of their situation etched in the lines around her eyes. "Who was that calling so early?" she asked, moving to the coffee maker. Thomas hesitated, then decided there was no point in false hope. "Andrews just wanted to say goodbye, I guess." Margaret nodded, accepting his explanation without further questions. "Jason called. He'll be here in an hour. The West Ridge representatives are scheduled for 9. 2 hours. 2 hours until they'd hand over the keys and sign the final papers. 2 hours until 3 generations of history came to an end. I need to do one last check of the equipment," Thomas said, rising from his chair. Margaret touched his arm gently. "Do you want company?" He covered her hand with his own. "No, this one I need to do alone." Outside, the morning air was cool, and crisp early fall in Montana bringing a hint of the winter to come. Thomas walked slowly toward the south pasture, memories flooding back with each step. He remembered the day in 1975 when his father had first shown him how to calibrate the monitoring equipment. The night in 1983 when they'd tracked an experimental communications array being tested against Soviet jamming technology. The spring morning in 1991 when they'd received word that communication systems refined on their farm had helped coordinate the complex air campaign during Desert Storm. Thomas reached the field's edge and looked at the monitoring stations, most now emptied. Of their sensitive equipment, just empty shells waiting to be dismantled. For decades, the Whitfield family had maintained this field with a dedication that went far beyond ordinary farming. Every season brought its own challenges, ensuring the equipment remained operational through harsh Montana winters, protecting delicate sensors from summer thunderstorms, maintaining the precise soil conditions needed for accurate readings. During the height of the Cold War, Thomas's father had established a careful routine. Every morning and evening he would walk the field's perimeter, checking each monitoring station. Every week he would transmit data readings to military analysts. Every month he would recalibrate the equipment according to specifications that changed regularly for security reasons. Thomas had continued these traditions faithfully after his father passed, adding his own innovations as technology evolved. When digital systems replaced analog ones in the late 1980s, he had learned an entirely new set of maintenance protocols. When satellite uplinks became necessary in the 1990s, he had mastered their operation. When cybersecurity became a concern, in the 2000s, he had implemented every recommended precaution, regardless of how complex. All this while still running a working farm, planting, harvesting, managing livestock, and keeping up with the endless paperwork of modern agriculture. The military had always recognized the burden this placed on the Whitfield family. Twice a year, officers would visit personally to express their appreciation. Occasionally, soldiers whose lives had been saved by technology tested on Clearwater Farm would stop by to shake Thomas's hand and thank him in person. Captain Maria Diaz had been the most recent visitor, arriving unannounced last spring. A communications specialist who had maintained critical links during a harrowing operation in mountainous terrain. She had brought her young son along. "I wanted him to see this place," Diaz had explained, watching the boy chase butterflies across the pasture. "I wanted him to know that sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they're just dedicated people doing extraordinary things without recognition." Thomas had been embarrassed by her praise but touched by the gesture. Now, as he checked the last monitoring station one final time, he wondered what would happen to soldiers like Diaz without the unique testing capabilities his land provided. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Jason's truck was coming up the driveway right on schedule. Thomas took one last look at the field and whispered a farewell too private to share with anyone else. Back at the house, Jason was helping Margaret gather the last of their personal belongings. The furniture would stay, part of the deal with Westridge, but photographs, heirlooms, and 3 generations of memories needed to be packed away. "All set at the field?" Jason asked, his voice carefully neutral. At 42, he had his father's height and his mother's gentler features, but today his face showed strain. Though he hadn't chosen to continue the family legacy, he understood what this day meant to his parents. Thomas nodded, "As ready as it'll ever be." For the next hour, they worked in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for the final handover. At precisely 8:45, 2 black SUVs appeared at the end of the driveway. "Right on schedule," Jason muttered, his jaw tightening. As the vehicles approached, corporate efficiency at its finest, Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember what your grandfather always said. A Whitfield faces the hard days standing tall." Jason nodded, squaring his shoulders as the SUVs parked in front of the house. 4 men and 1 woman in expensive suits emerged, led by Alexandra. Camden herself. The CEO's presence was unexpected. These finalities were usually left to underlings, but perhaps she wanted the satisfaction of personally closing the deal that had been so difficult to secure. "Mr. Whitfield," Camden called, approaching with an extended hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I trust you're ready to proceed." Thomas shook the offered hand briefly. "We've done our part. Everything's as agreed." Camden nodded, gesturing toward the house. "Excellent. Shall we go inside to handle the paperwork? My team has everything prepared." As they moved toward the porch, the distant sound of helicopter rotors became audible. Thomas glanced up, momentarily confused. The military had already removed their equipment. There shouldn't be any more flights scheduled. Camden frowned, following Thomas's gaze toward the empty sky. "Expecting company, Mr. Whitfield?" "No," Thomas replied truthfully. "Military operations ended here last week." The sound grew louder, and suddenly a sleek Apache attack helicopter appeared over the tree line, flying low and fast toward the south pasture. Its distinctive silhouette was unmistakable. The twin-engine, 4-blade configuration unlike any civilian aircraft. "What the hell?" one of Camden's assistants muttered, shielding his eyes against the sun to get a better look. Thomas was equally surprised, but something in his expression must have betrayed his recognition of the aircraft, because Camden turned to him sharply. "Is this some kind of last-minute stunt, Whitfield? Because I assure you it won't change anything." Before Thomas could respond, the Apache executed a perfect landing in the center of the south pasture, its rotors kicking up dust that swirled in the morning light. The engines remained running as the cockpit opened and a figure in a flight suit emerged, helmet still in place. "Mr. Whitfield," the pilot called, voice amplified by a speaker system, "General Andrews sends his compliments and requests your immediate presence at the field." Thomas stood frozen for a moment, Andrews' cryptic phone call suddenly making sense. The general hadn't given up after all. But what could possibly be done now, with the contracts signed and the lawyers present? Camden's face darkened with anger. "This is completely inappropriate. We have a legally binding agreement." "I should see what they want," Thomas interrupted, already moving toward the field. "Military matters take precedence." "Not anymore, they don't," Camden snapped. But Thomas was already walking away, followed closely by Margaret and Jason. As they approached the helicopter, the pilot removed their helmet, revealing Captain Diaz's face. She smiled grimly at Thomas's obvious surprise. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance, sir," she said, "but time is critical, and the general was insistent that we speak with you before any final papers are signed." "What's going on, Captain?" Thomas asked, raising his voice over the sound of the idling rotors. Diaz gestured toward the helicopter's communication system. "The general will explain himself, sir. He's standing by on a secure channel." Thomas exchanged a look with Margaret and Jason, then nodded. Whatever was happening, it offered a reprieve, however brief, from the finality of the morning's scheduled events. And after 40 years of answering when his country called, he wasn't about to stop now, especially not on what might be his last day at Clearwater Farm. 6 months earlier, Thomas had been repairing a fence line when Colonel Peterson's government-issue SUV had pulled up to the farmhouse. The colonel's unexpected arrival on a Tuesday afternoon was unusual enough to make Thomas straighten up and remove his work gloves. "Afternoon, Colonel," Thomas called, walking over to meet the officer. "Didn't expect to see you until next week's scheduled tests." Peterson's face was grim as he shook Thomas's hand. "That's why I'm here. There's been a development you need to know about." Margaret appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. One look at Peterson's expression told her this wasn't a social call. "Coffee, Colonel?" she offered. "Appreciated, Mrs. Whitfield, but this can't wait." Thomas led him to the old barn, converted years ago into a makeshift command center for when military personnel needed to work on site. Once inside, Peterson didn't waste time. "There's a development company called Westridge looking to build a major resort in the region," he said, pulling out a folder of documents. "They've been buying up land all around you. Nearly 2,000 acres so far." Thomas shrugged. "Heard rumors. Something big was coming. Not the first time developers have eyed this area." He gestured around. "We've turned down plenty of offers over the years." Peterson shook his head. "This is different, Thomas. These people have serious political backing. Senator Holloway is personally championing the project. His brother-in-law is on their board of directors." At the mention of Holloway, Thomas's expression darkened. The senator had long resented the military's classified work at Clearwater Farm, especially after being denied access during a re-election campaign photo opportunity years ago. "They're promising 3,000 jobs and a massive boost to the local tax base," Peterson continued. "The kind of numbers that make county commissioners stop asking questions." Thomas leaned against a workbench, processing the information. "What does this mean for our operation?" They've already secured zoning changes for the surrounding properties. The resort they're planning would completely disrupt our testing capabilities, even if you kept your land. Can't the Pentagon step in? This is national security we're talking about. Peterson's silence told Thomas everything he needed to know. They've tried, Thomas, but this is all happening on paper as economic development. Nothing classified has been officially compromised, and with the current administration looking to win the state in the next election. Politics, Thomas muttered, always comes down to politics. 3 days later, the first official letter had arrived from Westridge Development Corporation, an offer to purchase Clearwater Farm for twice its market value. Thomas had tossed it in a drawer without response. A week later, a second offer came along with glossy brochures showing artists' renderings of the proposed resort complex. By month's end, representatives began appearing at the farm unannounced. Always polite, always professional, but increasingly persistent. The third month brought lawyers with talks of eminent domain and the greater economic good. The fourth month brought pressure from the county commissioner's office about outdated zoning designations that suddenly needed review. Alexandra. Camden made her first appearance in the fifth month. The CEO's helicopter had landed without permission at the edge of Thomas's property, a power move designed to intimidate. Tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Thomas's truck, Camden had strode across the field as if she already owned it. "Mr. Whitfield," she'd called out, extending her hand with practiced charm. "Alexandra, Camden, I think it's time we spoke directly." Thomas had been mending a tractor, honest work that Camden clearly found distasteful. The CEO had pointedly avoided shaking Thomas's oil-stained hand. "I understand your attachment to this place," Camden had begun, glancing around with the calculating eye of a developer already visualizing bulldozers at work. "Family legacy is important, but progress is inevitable." "Not interested in selling," Thomas had replied flatly, "as I've told your people repeatedly." Camden's smile hadn't faltered. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Whitfield. I'm prepared to offer yours." The figure Camden named would have set the Whitfield family up for generations, enough to buy a better farm elsewhere, fund Jason's children's college educations, and still have plenty left over for a comfortable retirement. For a moment, Thomas had been tempted, not for himself, but for his family's future. But then he'd remembered his father's words on his deathbed 8 years earlier. "This land isn't just dirt, Tommy, it's part of something bigger than us. Don't let it go unless you absolutely must." The answer's still no, Thomas had said firmly. Camden's pleasant facade had slipped momentarily. "That's disappointing. I had hoped to keep this amicable." "Nothing amicable about trying to take what isn't yours," Thomas had responded. Camden's eyes had hardened. "Let me be clear, Mr. Whitfield. Westridge Development will build our resort here. The only question is whether you benefit financially or fight a losing battle. Seems like you're counting your chickens before they hatch." "I'm counting on history and economics," Camden had countered. "Progress always wins in America. Always. Your operation here, whatever it is, can surely be relocated. Our facility cannot." "Why here?" Thomas had demanded. "Thousands of acres in this state. Why my farm?" Something had flickered across Camden's face, a moment of calculation, as if deciding how much to reveal. Location, infrastructure, tax incentives, many factors, she'd waved dismissively. "My technical team selected this site as optimal. I don't question their expertise. But Thomas hadn't missed that moment of hesitation. Later, he'd mentioned it to Colonel Peterson, who promised to dig deeper into Westridge's sudden interest in this particular location. 2 weeks later, Peterson had returned, his expression more troubled than before. "Westridge's parent company has some interesting connections," he'd said quietly once they were alone in the barn. "Defense contractors, foreign investors with questionable ties, nothing concrete, but enough red flags to make some people at the Pentagon nervous." "You think they know about the geological formation?" Thomas asked. Peterson had nodded gravely. "We think they might. Building a resort here would effectively neutralize the testing capabilities we've relied on." "Could be coincidence," Thomas had suggested without much conviction. "Could be," Peterson had agreed. "Problem is proving it. They've got everything wrapped up in legitimate business dealings, and their political allies are making sure normal channels of investigation stay blocked." That conversation had marked the beginning of what Thomas now thought of as the siege. Westridge's tactics had escalated from persuasion to pressure to what bordered on harassment. Surveyors appeared at the property lines daily. Environmental inspectors suddenly found concerns that needed addressing. Tax assessors discovered errors in previous evaluations, resulting in a sudden, crippling tax bill. Jason had been the first to connect the dots. "They're trying to bleed us dry, Dad," he'd said one evening over dinner. "Make keeping the farm so expensive and difficult that selling becomes the only option." "The military's still looking into Westridge," Thomas had assured him. "If they're up to something beyond just business, it'll come out." But time was running out. Legal challenges drained their savings. The mysterious tax reassessment tied up what remained in appeals. Equipment malfunctions, too convenient to be coincidental, disrupted their farming operations. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago. Thomas had arrived at the south pasture one morning to find all 8 monitoring stations damaged, precision components smashed, data logs erased, backup systems compromised. The damage had been carefully done to look like vandalism, but Thomas knew better. This was targeted, professional sabotage. When Peterson had investigated, his findings offered little comfort. "They've covered their tracks well, nothing we can prove." "So that's it?" Thomas had demanded. 3 generations of service, and we just give up?" Peterson's face had shown genuine regret. "The Pentagon's hands are tied, Thomas. Without evidence of deliberate national security interference, they can't officially intervene. And with the equipment compromised, we've lost our testing capabilities anyway." That night, for the first time, Thomas had seriously considered Camden's offer. The military had already begun relocating their operations. The bank was making noises about the overdue mortgage. Margaret and Jason were bearing the brunt of his stubbornness. "Maybe it's time," Margaret had suggested gently. "We fought the good fight, Thomas. No one would blame you for acknowledging reality." The next day, Thomas had called Camden's office. "I'm listening to your offer," he'd said simply when the CEO came on the line. Camden's satisfaction had been palpable even through the phone. "A wise decision, Mr. Whitfield. I'll have my team draw up the papers immediately. On one condition," Thomas had added. "We need 60 days to relocate." 30, Camden had countered immediately. "Our construction schedule is tight." They'd settled on 45 days, enough time, Thomas hoped, for the military's investigation to turn up something concrete. But as the days passed with no breakthrough, that hope had faded. 2 weeks ago, the preliminary paperwork had been signed. 1 week ago, the military had removed the last of their equipment. Yesterday, Thomas had received the final eviction notice. And now, as Alexandra Camden stood on Thomas's porch, preparing to complete the takeover of Clearwater Farm, an Apache helicopter had landed in the south pasture, bearing a message from General Andrews himself. As Thomas approached the helicopter with Camden angrily shouting behind him, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the military's last-ditch effort to stop whatever Westridge was really planning, or simply a ceremonial thank you for years of service. Captain Diaz gestured toward the communications headset hanging near the cockpit door. "General Andrews is standing by, sir. He says it's urgent and classified." Thomas glanced back at the house where Camden and her lawyers were watching with obvious frustration. After everything that had happened, it was hard to feel even a flicker of hope. But 40 years of answering his country's call wasn't a habit. Easily broken, he took the headset and put it on, adjusting the microphone. "General Thomas Whitfield here." "Thomas," Andrew's voice came through with military precision. "Sorry for the dramatics, but we've got something big. And we've got exactly 18 minutes to stop Westridge before it's too late." "What do you mean, 18 minutes?" Thomas asked, his voice steady, despite the surge of adrenaline the general's words had triggered. "Exactly what I said," the general replied. "Captain Diaz will brief you on the immediate situation. I've dispatched a team that will arrive within the hour, but we need you to stall Camden until then. Under no circumstances can you sign those final papers." Before Thomas could ask more questions, Diaz cut in. "Sir, we need to move quickly. I'm authorized to show you classified intelligence." She reached into a secure compartment and withdrew, a tablet in a reinforced case. As she activated it, the screen displayed a series of satellite images showing Clearwater Farm and the surrounding properties. Thomas recognized the familiar layout of his land, but something was different about the overlay markings. 3 days ago, one of our intelligence analysts noticed an anomaly in Westridge's construction plans, Diaz explained, zooming in on the image. "They're positioning their primary resort complex directly above the deepest part of the geological formation in your south pasture." Thomas frowned. "That would disrupt their operations. Those natural signal properties would play havoc with guest communications, Wi-Fi, everything." "Exactly," Diaz nodded. "Unless disrupting communications was precisely the point." She swiped to another screen, showing technical specifications and what appeared to be partially redacted engineering documents. "We believe Westridge isn't building a conventional resort at all. They're constructing what amounts to a massive signals intelligence gathering facility, using the natural properties of your land to enhance its capabilities. The kind of system that could intercept military and government communications across a significant radius." Thomas's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. "A spy center." "Potentially," Diaz confirmed, "one capable of monitoring sensitive military communications, especially from Fort Harrison and the missile command facilities in the region, all while appearing to be nothing more than a corporate resort suffering occasional communications issues." Thomas thought of Camden's insistence on this particular location, her careful evasion when asked directly about site selection. It made a terrible kind of sense now. "Who are they working for?" he asked. "That's still under investigation," Diaz replied. "But we've traced funding through several shell companies with connections to foreign intelligence operations." The chairman of Westridge's parent company made 3 trips to Beijing and Moscow in the past year alone. Thomas glanced back toward the house, where Camden was now on her phone, gesturing angrily. "What happens in 18 minutes?" Diaz checked her watch. 17 now. At exactly 0900 hours, Westridge is executing a wire transfer to complete the purchase of your property. Once that money hits your account, legally the land is theirs. They already have construction crews standing by to break ground this afternoon, far faster than any normal commercial project would move. Why not just arrest Camden now? You have evidence. Circumstantial at best, Diaz admitted. Enough for us to act on internally, but not enough for a public accusation against a company with Westridge's political connections. We need to secure the land first, then build the case. Thomas processed this information, decades of military cooperation guiding his thinking. What do you need me to do? Delay the final signing, find any reason, create any distraction. The general has mobilized a special Pentagon legal team with national security intervention paperwork, but they need time to get here. Thomas nodded grimly. I can do that. As he removed the headset, Thomas found himself facing a furious Alexandra Camden, who had apparently decided waiting was no longer an option. The CEO had marched halfway across the field, trailed by her attorneys and Jason, who was trying to intercept them. "This is completely unacceptable, Whitfield," Camden shouted over the idling helicopter rotors. "We have a binding agreement with a scheduled closing time." Thomas stepped away from the helicopter, positioning himself between Camden and Captain Diaz, who was quickly securing the classified materials. "Seems we have a slight complication," Thomas said, his voice deceptively casual. Camden's face flushed with anger. "The only complication I see is this military intrusion on what is about to be private property. Our closing is scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp." Thomas checked his watch deliberately. "Still got 15 minutes by my count, which we should be using to complete the paperwork," one of Camden's attorneys interjected. "The wire transfer is scheduled to execute automatically at 9. "Might need to postpone that," Thomas suggested. "Some questions have come up about the property that need addressing." "What questions?" Camden demanded. "Everything has been thoroughly vetted. The surveys, the inspections, the title search, all clean." Thomas met Camden's gaze steadily. Maybe not everything. Something shifted in Camden's expression. A flicker of uncertainty quickly masked by renewed confidence. "This is a transparent delay tactic, Mr. Whitfield. I expected better from you." Jason stepped forward, catching onto his father's strategy without knowing the details. "Actually, I found some discrepancies in the property boundaries this morning. The survey might not match the historical deed." The lawyer scoffed. "We have 3 independent surveys confirming the boundaries. This is absurd." "Wouldn't be the first time surveyors miss something," Thomas countered, "especially regarding the mineral rights beneath the south pasture." At the mention of mineral rights, Camden's attention sharpened noticeably. "The agreement covers all rights, surface, mineral, and air." "Does it cover signal anomalies?" Thomas asked innocently. The question landed like a stone dropping into still water. Camden's practiced corporate mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully. "I think you do," Thomas replied. "I think that's exactly why you want this specific piece of land, despite all the other available properties in the county." Camden glanced at her watch, then at her lawyers, a silent communication passing between them. "These insinuations are both offensive and irrelevant to our transaction, Mr. Whitfield. We selected this site based on standard corporate criteria: access to power infrastructure, proximity to highways, and favorable topography. And the unusual signal-blocking field had nothing to do with it?" Thomas pressed. Camden's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to debate site selection with a farmer. The papers are ready for signing, and we have—" She checked her watch again. 13 minutes until the closing time. I suggest we proceed inside and complete this transaction as agreed." Thomas stood his ground. "I'd like my attorney to review the final documents first." "Your attorney already reviewed them last week," the Westridge lawyer objected. "I want a second opinion," Thomas insisted. "These last-minute military concerns have me worried." Camden stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Let me be very clear. Mr. Whitfield, you've signed a binding agreement. If you attempt to back out now, we will sue you for every penny you have. Your family will be tied up in litigation for the next decade." It was a potent threat. The Whitfields had already depleted their savings fighting the previous legal battles. Even with the sale proceeds, they couldn't withstand a prolonged court fight against Westridge's resources. Margaret appeared at Thomas's side, having crossed the field during the confrontation. She slipped her hand into his, a silent show of support that reinforced his resolve. "Then I guess we'll see you in court," Thomas said, meeting Camden's gaze without flinching. For a moment it seemed Camden might explode with rage. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You really have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? What's at stake here?" "I think maybe I do," Thomas replied evenly. "Question is, do you know what you're really building here? Or are you just following orders from whoever's actually signing your checks?" The barb struck home. Camden's composure cracked further. "You think your little farm matters in the grand scheme? You think your decades of playing soldier with the military gives you any real power? I have senators on speed dial, Mr. Whitfield. I had dinner with the vice president last month. And yet, here you are, arguing with a farmer in a field," Thomas observed. "Must be pretty important to bring the CEO herself for a simple land closing." Camden checked her watch again, growing visibly more agitated as the minutes ticked by. She turned to her team. "Call the office. Tell them to execute the wire transfer immediately, not at 9. One of the attorneys pulled out her phone and stepped away to make the call, but Captain Diaz was already speaking quietly into her own communication device. Thomas caught fragments about accelerated timeline and contingency authorization. Michael moved closer to his father. "What's really happening here, Dad?" he asked in a low voice. "Tell you later," Thomas murmured. "For now, just know we can't let them take the farm. Not today." Camden's attorney returned, her expression troubled. "Sir, the bank says they can't modify the automated transfer. It's locked into the system for 0900 execution." "Then get someone to override it." Camden snapped. "They're trying, but it requires additional authorization codes from the main office." Thomas felt a surge of hope. 10 minutes. They just needed to hold out for 10 more minutes until Andrew's team arrived. Camden turned back to Thomas, all pretense of civility gone. "Sign the papers now, Whitfield, right here, right now, and we can proceed regardless of the wire timing." Thomas shook his head, not without proper legal counsel present. "You've had months of legal counsel," Camden retorted, "and now I need more, given these new military concerns." Camden's face contorted with barely contained fury. She gestured sharply to her security personnel, who had remained by the SUVs until now. "Escort Mr. Whitfield to the house. We're finishing this transaction immediately." As the security men started forward, Captain Diaz stepped up beside Thomas, her hand resting meaningfully on her sidearm. "That would be unwise, sir. Mr. Whitfield is currently engaged in a matter of national security." Camden looked from Diaz to Thomas, then to the helicopter still idling in the field. Her calculation was visible, weighing the costs of further confrontation against whatever timeline she was working under. 7 minutes, Thomas said quietly, checking his watch. "Awful lot of trouble for one small farm, wouldn't you say, Ms. Camden?" The CEO's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you've done." She turned abruptly to her team. "Get on the phone. Call Senator Holloway now." As one of the attorneys hastily dialed, the distant sound of approaching helicopters became audible. Not just one, but several, growing louder by the second. Captain Diaz smiled slightly. "Sounds like the cavalry has arrived early." Camden's face paled as she looked to the horizon, where 3 military helicopters were now visible, approaching rapidly from the east. Whatever advantage she had counted on was rapidly disappearing with each passing second. "This isn't over, Whitfield," she said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "Not by a long shot." Thomas stood his ground, Margaret and Jason flanking him on either side as they watched the reinforcements approach. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but for the first time in months, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. "You're right about one thing," Thomas replied, as the helicopters began their descent, kicking up swirls of dust across the south pasture. "It isn't over. In fact, I think it's just getting started." As the 3 military helicopters touched, down in formation across the south pasture, Thomas couldn't help but remember how different things had been just 4 months earlier, before Westridge's arrival had changed everything. Back then, Clearwater Farm hadn't stood alone. The surrounding farms and properties had formed a close-knit community, families who had worked this land for generations, supporting each other through hard times and good harvests alike. The Anderson place had been the first to go. Old Jim Anderson, at 79, had no children interested in taking over his 250 acres. When Westridge offered him triple the market value, he'd signed the papers within a week. Thomas couldn't blame him. Jim's health was failing, and the money would pay for the assisted living facility he'd been putting off entering. "It's just business, Thomas," Jim had told him over a final beer on his porch. "Nothing personal." But it had felt personal when Jim's century-old farmhouse was demolished just days after the closing, replaced by temporary offices for Westridge's advance team. The speed of the destruction had shocked everyone in the community. There had been no respect for history, no acknowledgement of what the Anderson farm had meant to the area. Just bulldozers and efficiency. The Pattersons had been next, a young couple who had inherited their land from Caroline's parents just 2 years earlier. They had dreams of organic farming, but were drowning in student debt. Westridge's offer had been their lifeline. "We can start fresh somewhere else," Caroline had explained apologetically when she told Thomas they were selling. "Somewhere land is cheaper. This money will set us up right." Thomas had nodded, understanding, but he'd felt the first real pinch of isolation when the Pattersons moved out. Their farm had bordered his to the east, and they had often shared equipment during busy seasons. The Baniwalas had held out longer, Their 60 acres of pristine orchards had been in the family since they immigrated from India in the 1970s, and Raj Baniwala was as stubborn as Thomas when it came to tradition. But after a mysterious blight destroyed half their apple trees in a single season, a blight that somehow affected only their property, they too had succumbed to Westridge's persistent offers. "Sometimes you must bend before you break," Raj had said philosophically as they signed the papers. "But Thomas, be careful. These people, there is something not right about how they operate." By the time Westridge set its sights directly on Clearwater Farm, the Whitfields were already surrounded. The community that had once stood together through droughts, floods, and economic downturns had been systematically dismantled, family by family, farm by farm. Thomas had watched it happen with growing unease. Each sale had made the next one easier, creating a domino effect that left the Whitfields increasingly isolated. The neighbors who would have once rallied to support them were gone, replaced by corporate security guards and construction crews who watched Clearwater Farm with calculating eyes. Even in town, support had dwindled as Westridge's influence grew. The promise of jobs and economic revitalization had turned public opinion. At the diner where Thomas had eaten breakfast every Saturday for decades, conversations would awkwardly pause when he entered. The hardware store owner, who had been one of his closest friends, suddenly had no time to chat. The local newspaper ran glowing profiles of Alexandra Camden, describing her as a visionary bringing prosperity to a struggling rural economy. Jason had felt the isolation most keenly at the county planning meetings. Once respected as a third-generation farmer and volunteer firefighter, he now found himself portrayed as an obstacle to progress when he raised legitimate concerns about water usage and infrastructure impact from the proposed resort. "It's like they've already decided," he told Thomas afterward, "like we're the bad guys for asking questions." Margaret had encountered the changing attitudes at church, where several parishioners had benefited from Westridge's land purchases. Longtime friends suddenly suggested that perhaps the Whitfields were being selfish for holding out. "Think of the community," Elaine Foster had said after Sunday service. "All those jobs, the tax revenue for schools." "What about the families who've been displaced?" Margaret had countered. "The farms that have been destroyed." Elaine had simply shrugged. "People move on. That's progress." Even Colonel Peterson had begun to distance himself as the military's official position remained neutral. His visits became less frequent, his communications more formal. Thomas understood. Peterson was a career officer caught between his personal loyalty to the Whitfields and his professional obligations. "My hands are tied, Thomas," he'd admitted during what turned out to be his last unofficial visit. "Without concrete evidence of national security concerns, the Pentagon won't intervene in what they're calling a private business matter." The final blow to their support system had come from the county commissioner's office. Harold Beckman had been a friend of Thomas's father, had fished with Thomas every summer for decades. But when Westridge donated a new wing to the county hospital, conveniently named after Commissioner Beckman, his priorities had shifted. "Thomas, you know I respect what your family has done," Harold had said during an uncomfortable meeting in his office. "But times change. You can't stand in the way of the future." The zoning changes had been approved the following week, stripping Clearwater Farm of its agricultural protections and opening the door for Westridge's final push. In their growing isolation, the Whitfields had turned inward, relying on each other more than ever. Jason spent his evenings at the farmhouse rather than his own small home nearby, helping Thomas review legal documents and search for ways to fight back. Margaret kept the household running, maintaining a sense of normalcy even as their world crumbled around them. Thomas focused on the farm operations, stubbornly following the routines of planting and harvesting as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. As their legal options dwindled and their financial resources were stretched to the breaking point, Thomas began to understand the ruthless strategy Westridge had employed. Isolation wasn't just a byproduct of their expansion. It was a deliberate tactic. Divide and conquer, remove support systems, make the holdouts feel alone and powerless until resistance seemed futile. The night before the final eviction notice arrived, Thomas had stood alone in the south pasture, looking up at the stars his family had farmed under for 3 generations. The same stars that guided soldiers whose communication systems were tested on this land. For the first time, he had allowed himself to consider surrender, not because he wanted to, but because fighting alone against such overwhelming force seemed impossible. "Dad?" Jason's voice had come from behind him. "You okay out here?" Thomas had turned to find his son approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "Just thinking." Jason had handed him a steaming mug. "About tomorrow? About everything? What Grandpa would do in my shoes?" They had stood in silence for a moment. Father and son contemplating the weight of legacy. "I've been thinking," Jason had said finally, "if we have to sell, and I'm not saying we should, but if we do, I could buy a smaller place. Keep the Whitfield name in farming at least." The concession had cost Jason visibly, his face tight with reluctant pragmatism. Thomas had recognized the sacrifice his son was prepared to make, setting aside his anger to ensure some piece of their heritage survived. "Maybe," Thomas had acknowledged, "but not yet. Not while we still have options." But the next morning, when the final eviction notice arrived, those options had seemed to vanish entirely. Thomas had stood on his porch, paper in hand, feeling the full weight of their isolation. No neighbors left to rally around them, no legal recourse remaining, no military support forthcoming. Just 3 Whitfields against the inevitable march of progress. Now, as the military helicopters settled onto the south pasture and uniformed personnel began disembarking, Thomas felt a surreal shift in the balance of power. The isolation that had seemed so complete just moments ago was suddenly broken by this unexpected show of force. Camden's face registered shock as she watched at least a dozen armed military personnel establish a perimeter around the field. Her attorney was frantically speaking into his phone, while the security team from the SUVs stood uncertainly, clearly outmatched. A tall, distinguished man in a general's uniform emerged from the lead helicopter and strode purposefully toward them. Even at a distance, Thomas recognized Robert Andrews, though it had been years since they'd met in person. "That's a lot of firepower for a farm closing," Jason observed quietly. "Something tells me it's not about the farm anymore," Thomas replied. Captain Diaz moved to intercept the general, offering a crisp salute before conferring briefly. Andrews nodded, then continued toward Thomas and the others. "Mr. Whitfield," he called, extending his hand as he approached. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance. Timing became critical." Thomas grasped the offered hand firmly. "General, it's been a while." "Too long," Andrews agreed before turning his attention to Camden. "Ms. Camden, I presume. I'm General Robert Andrews, United States Military Intelligence Command. Camden had recovered enough of her composure to affect an air of outraged authority. "This is an outrageous interference in a private business transaction, General. I'll be speaking with the Secretary of Defense about this immediately." "Feel free," Andrews replied evenly. "In fact, I just got off the phone with him. He sends his regards and his full authorization for what's about to happen." One of Andrews' aides approached with a document folder, which the general accepted without taking his eyes off Camden. "Effective immediately by executive order, Clearwater Farm and the surrounding properties are being placed under military jurisdiction as a matter of national security," Andrews announced, opening the folder to reveal official paperwork. "All private development activities are suspended pending a full investigation." Camden's attorney stepped forward. "You can't do this. We have binding contracts." "Actually, we can," Andrews countered, handing over a document bearing the presidential seal. "National Security Presidential Directive 51 gives us full authority when critical infrastructure is threatened. And make no mistake, Miss Camden, we consider what's happening here a direct threat." Thomas exchanged glances with Margaret and Jason, all three struggling to process this sudden reversal of fortune. After months of fighting alone, after watching their community disintegrate around them, after preparing themselves for defeat, they suddenly found themselves at the center of what appeared to be a major military operation. "What exactly is happening?" "Here, General," Thomas asked quietly as Camden and her team frantically reviewed the documents. Andrews turned to him, lowering his voice. "The short version? We've been investigating Westridge for months, but couldn't move without solid evidence. Captain Diaz's team found it 3 days ago. Technical specifications hidden in their construction plans that match signal intelligence. Gathering technology being developed by hostile foreign powers." "So I was right," Thomas said. "They want the geological anomaly for intelligence gathering." "You were right," Andrews confirmed, "and your stalling tactics this morning gave us the final authorization we needed for direct intervention." He glanced at his watch, which came through exactly 2 minutes before their wire transfer was set to execute. Margaret stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" "Now," Andrews said, "we secure this property and begin a full investigation into Westridge's activities. As for Clearwater Farm—" He smiled slightly. "I believe we're about to renew our working relationship with the Whitfield family on much more formal terms." Thomas looked across the field where he had walked alone just hours earlier, feeling the weight of isolation crushing down on him. Now it teemed with activity as military personnel established equipment and security posts. The land that had seemed destined for destruction was suddenly the center of renewed purpose. "You're not alone in this anymore, Thomas," Andrews said, reading his thoughts. "Should have stepped in sooner, but we needed to let things play out to catch the bigger fish." Thomas nodded his understanding, though the months of struggle still weighed heavily. "Better late than never, I suppose." As Camden and her team were escorted to a secure area for questioning, Margaret took Thomas's hand. "Looks like the Whitfields aren't finished standing watch after all," she said quietly. Thomas squeezed her hand in response, watching as Jason engaged with a military engineer, already discussing plans for reinstalling monitoring equipment in the south pasture. The isolation that had defined their recent months was shattered, replaced by a flurry of purposeful activity. Whatever came next, they would face it not alone, but with the full support of the country they had quietly served for 3 generations. 2 days before the Apache helicopter landed in his south pasture, Thomas Whitfield had faced what he believed was the end of everything his family had built. The morning had begun like any other. Coffee at dawn, a quick check of the remaining livestock, and a silent walk around the property that would soon belong to someone else. But by afternoon, the weight of surrender had become undeniable. As he stood before the worn fence post at the farm's entrance, in his hands, Thomas held a weathered wooden sign he had spent the morning carefully crafting in his workshop. Each letter had been carved with deliberate precision, each word chosen to convey what could not be expressed in legal documents or financial settlements. This was his final statement, his testament to what Clearwater Farm had truly been. Margaret stood beside him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. They had done their crying in private the night before. Now was the time for dignity in the face of defeat. "It's a fine sign, Thomas," she said softly. "Your father would approve." Thomas nodded, running his fingers over the carved letters one last time. The wood was oak, harvested from a tree that had fallen on their property during a storm 5 years earlier. He had saved the lumber, knowing its strength and durability would serve some important purpose someday. He had never imagined it would be this. Jason pulled up in his truck, cutting the engine, but remaining seated for a long moment before stepping out. His expression was carefully neutral, masking the anger Thomas knew still simmered beneath the surface. They had argued bitterly the previous week when Thomas had finally conceded defeat and agreed to Westridge's terms. Jason had wanted to fight on, to find some miracle solution that would save the farm. Thomas had been the one to accept reality. Their money was gone, their legal options exhausted, their support evaporated. "That it?" Jason asked, eyeing the sign as he approached. "That's it," Thomas confirmed. The three Whitfields stood in silence, regarding the carved words that would soon be the only remaining mark of their stewardship. Notice: Military Communications Research Site closing Clearwater Farm, serving our nation's defense since 1950. We thank you for allowing us to protect those who protect us below this. Thomas had added the Whitfield family crest, a simple design featuring a wheat stalk and a compass, symbolizing both agricultural roots and the guidance they had provided to the military for generations. "They'll probably throw it away the minute." "We're gone," Jason said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged, "but it's not for them. It's for us, for the record." With careful reverence, Thomas mounted the sign on the fence post, securing it with screws rather than nails, a small act of permanence in the face of impending erasure. As he stepped back to regard his work, a car approached on the gravel road, Colonel Peterson making what would likely be his final unofficial visit. The officer parked alongside Jason's truck and walked over, his uniform impeccable as always, but his expression troubled. He surveyed the sign without comment, then turned to Thomas. "Wanted to check in before everything. See if you needed anything." Thomas appreciated the gesture, knowing Peterson was defying unofficial orders by maintaining personal contact with the Whitfields during the final transition. "We're managing," Thomas replied, "just marking the occasion." Peterson read the sign carefully, then nodded his approval. "Appropriate and accurate." He hesitated before adding, "For what it's worth, there are people at the Pentagon who aren't happy about this situation. People who understand what's being lost." "Understanding doesn't change anything," Jason interjected sharply. "No," Peterson agreed. "It doesn't." The colonel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small metal object, a challenge coin bearing the insignia of his unit, the Tactical Communications Development Squadron. "This isn't official," he said, pressing the coin into Thomas's palm, "but the men and women of my squadron wanted you to have it. You've been as much a part of our operations as anyone in uniform." Thomas closed his fingers around the coin, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. "Thank them for me." Peterson nodded, glancing at his watch. "I should go. They're monitoring my movements more closely these days." He offered his hand first to Thomas, then to Jason and Margaret. "It's been an honor knowing your family." After Peterson departed, the three Whitfields remained by the sign, none of them ready to turn away from this tangible acknowledgement of their defeat. "I've been thinking," Jason said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Maybe we should go public with everything. Tell the media what this place really is, what Westridge is destroying. National security be damned." Thomas shook his head. "We gave our word, son. 3 generations of Whitfields kept that promise. We don't break it now, even at the end, even if keeping it means losing everything." "Especially then," Thomas said firmly. "Character is what you do when nobody's watching. Integrity is what you maintain when it costs you everything." Jason didn't argue further, but his posture remained tense with unresolved fury. Margaret stepped between them, placing a hand on each man's arm. "Come on," she said gently. "I've made pot roast, your father's favorite." She added to Jason, "Let's not spend our last evening fighting." As they turned toward the house, Thomas cast one final glance at the sign. It seemed both a eulogy and a defiance, acknowledging the end while asserting that what happened here had mattered, would always matter, regardless of what Westridge built upon these fields. That night, dinner had been a subdued affair. They ate in the kitchen rather than the dining room, surrounded by the accumulated memories of decades. Margaret had brought out the good china, a wedding gift from Thomas's parents, and opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving for a special occasion, not a celebration, but a commemoration. "Remember when Senator Wilson's security team thought Jason's science project was some kind of spy device?" Margaret asked, deliberately steering conversation toward lighter memories. Thomas smiled despite himself. The Secret Service agent's face when he realized he was interrogating a 10-year-old about a potato clock. "Mom had to bring out a special apple pie just to smooth things over," Jason added, momentarily setting aside his anger to join the reminiscence. They traded stories as the evening progressed, some funny, some poignant, all part of the tapestry of life at Clearwater Farm. The generations of military personnel who had passed through, the technological advancements they'd witnessed, the sense of purpose that had defined their unconventional relationship with national defense. After dinner, they'd moved to the porch, continuing their reflections as darkness settled over the farm. Thomas had brought out a box of photographs documenting the history they'd been part of, or at least the declassified portions. Images of his grandfather shaking hands with army generals in the 1950s, his father demonstrating equipment to serious men in uniforms during the height of the Cold War. Thomas himself, decades younger, standing proudly beside the first digital monitoring station installed in the South Pasture. "What will you miss most?" Margaret had asked as the night grew late. Thomas considered the question carefully. "The purpose," he said finally. "Knowing what we do here matters beyond just us." Jason had remained silent, staring out at the darkened fields. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "I always thought I'd be showing my kids how to maintain the equipment someday, continuing the tradition." The acknowledgement of that lost future had hung heavily between them. Whatever they built next, wherever they went after Clearwater Farm, that multi-generational continuity had been broken. The legacy ended with them. As midnight approached, Thomas had excused himself, needing some time alone before their final full day on the property. He'd walked to the south pasture one last time, using only moonlight to guide his way along the familiar path. The monitoring stations stood empty now, their sophisticated equipment removed weeks earlier, just metal shells remaining, waiting for Westridge's bulldozers. Standing in the center of the field, Thomas had allowed himself a moment of raw emotion, hidden from his family, the grief of surrender after such a long, determined fight, the anger at forces beyond his control, the sense of failure, irrational but powerful, at being the Whitfield who lost the farm after 3 generations of stewardship. "I'm sorry," he had whispered to the ghosts of his father and grandfather. "I tried everything I could." The next morning, Thomas had risen early as always, but with a new heaviness in his movements. The surrender had become real in a way it hadn't been before, not just an abstract future event, but an imminent reality. The final paperwork would arrive tomorrow. The wire transfer would execute. By this time, the next day, Clearwater Farm would exist only in memory and in the carved wooden sign at the entrance. He had spent that day, yesterday, methodically checking every structure on the property, ensuring nothing of personal or sentimental value would be left behind. In the equipment barn, he'd found his father's old toolbox tucked away on a high shelf. In the root cellar, several jars of Margaret's preserves from seasons past. In the attic of the main house, a box of his grandfather's journals documenting the early days of the military partnership. Small treasures, meaningless to anyone else but priceless to the Whitfields. Thomas had carefully packed each item, creating an archive of their history to carry forward to whatever came next. By evening, most of the packing had been completed. Their essential belongings were boxed and labeled, ready for loading into the moving trucks scheduled to arrive after the closing. The furniture would stay part of the sale agreement, but everything that made the house a home would go with them. That night, Thomas had lain awake long after Margaret fell asleep, listening to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old farmhouse. Tomorrow would bring Alexandra Camden and her attorneys with their final paperwork. Tomorrow would mark the end of everything he had worked for his entire life. In the darkness, Thomas had finally allowed himself to accept defeat completely, not just intellectually, but emotionally. The fight was over. They had lost. Whatever came next, it would be built on the ashes of surrender. Yet even in that moment of complete acceptance, something in Thomas had refused to break entirely, a stubborn core of Whitfield pride that acknowledged reality but didn't surrender dignity along with the land. They would walk away with their heads high. They would face Camden and her corporate vultures with the quiet strength that had defined this family for generations. With that resolution firm in his mind, Thomas had finally drifted into troubled sleep, unaware that in a secure military facility hundreds of miles away, General Andrews was reviewing new intelligence about Westridge that would change everything. Intelligence that would send an Apache helicopter to land in his south pasture just as surrender seemed absolute. 1 year later, Thomas Whitfield stood in the south pasture, watching military helicopters descend for a scheduled equipment upgrade. The farm looked different now. Enhanced monitoring stations dotted the landscape, and a small research facility occupied what had once been the east pasture. But the Whitfield farmhouse still stood, and the family still worked the land. Westridge's plans had been completely dismantled. Alexandra Camden now faced federal charges for corporate espionage and conspiracy. The neighboring farms had been repurchased by the government, and their original owners invited to return under new lease agreements that preserved both their livelihoods and the military testing capabilities. "Still feels strange having so many people around," Margaret said, joining Thomas on the porch. "Different kind of farming now," he agreed. The past year had brought transformations none of them could have imagined that morning when the Apache helicopter first landed. Within days of the military intervention, the truth about Westridge had begun to emerge. The company's parent corporation had been a front for a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation targeting U.S. military communications. The resort had been designed as a listening post, strategically positioned to exploit the unique geological properties of Clearwater Farm. Senator Holloway, Westridge's most powerful ally, had resigned in disgrace when financial connections to the foreign entities were uncovered. Commissioner Beckman and others who had facilitated the land grab faced investigations of their own. One by one, the dominoes had fallen. For the Whitfields, the change had been equally dramatic, but in a different direction. General Andrews had offered Thomas a formal contract, not just a handshake agreement like his grandfather and father had operated under, but official recognition of Clearwater Farm's role in national defense. Instead of fighting to keep their land, the Whitfields suddenly found themselves designated as essential personnel, their property classified as critical infrastructure. The new arrangement came with security clearances, proper compensation, and resources to expand their operation. Thomas spotted Jason walking alongside Colonel Peterson, deep in conversation about the next phase of the communications testing program. At 43, Jason had finally embraced the family legacy, bringing his engineering expertise to bear on improving the technology they hosted. He had moved back to the main property, building a new house just beyond the apple orchard. But the most meaningful change sat on Thomas's knee as he settled into the porch swing. His 5-year-old grandson, Daniel, who was visiting for the weekend. The boy was already fascinated by the special work his family did, though he was far too young to understand its significance. "Grandpa, tell me about the helicopter again," Daniel requested, his eyes wide with excitement. Thomas smiled. It had become the boy's favorite bedtime story, a tale of persistence, betrayal, and last-minute rescue, simplified for young ears but preserving the essential truth. "Well, there was a time when some not very nice people tried to take our farm away," Thomas began. "They thought no one would stand up to them because they had a lot of money and powerful friends." "But you didn't give up?" Daniel prompted, knowing this part well. "That's right. Even when it seemed like all was lost, we remembered what great-grandpa always said, a Whitfield faces the hard days standing tall. And then the helicopter came," Daniel exclaimed, clapping his hands. "Yes, it did, right when we needed it most, because sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, help comes from unexpected places, and sometimes the things that look like endings turn out to be new beginnings." Margaret brought out lemonade, ruffling Daniel's hair as she handed Thomas a glass. "Your storytelling gets more dramatic every time," she teased. "The facts speak for themselves," Thomas replied with a wink. Later that afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the fields, Thomas walked Daniel down to the farm's entrance. The Archde's wooden sign he had carved in that moment of despair still hung on the fence post, but it was no longer alone. Beside it, a new metal plaque had been installed during the official designation ceremony 6 months ago. Clearwater Farm Strategic Communications, Research Facility established 1950, securing America's technological advantage. "Can you read it?" Thomas asked his grandson. Daniel squinted at the letters, sounding them out carefully. At the bottom of the plaque was an additional line that Thomas had specifically requested: "The Whitfield family, standing watch for generations." "What does it mean, Grandpa?" Daniel asked. Thomas lifted the boy onto his shoulders, giving him a better view of the farm, the fields where crops grew alongside sophisticated monitoring equipment, the barn where researchers now worked alongside farmhands, the pastures where cattle grazed undisturbed by the occasional helicopter landing. "It means that sometimes the most important things people do aren't the ones everyone can see," Thomas explained. "And sometimes the quietest heroes are the ones who just keep showing up day after day, doing what needs to be done without anyone noticing." Daniel considered this. "Like you and Dad and Great-Grandpa?" "Exactly like that," Thomas confirmed. "And someday, maybe you too." As they turned back toward the house, Thomas spotted a military vehicle coming up the drive, General Andrews making his monthly inspection. The relationship between the Whitfields and the military had evolved, becoming more official but no less personal. What once seemed like the end had transformed into a new chapter, not just for the Whitfield family, but for all the neighboring farms that had been restored under the new program. The community that Westridge had systematically dismantled was slowly rebuilding, strengthened by the shared experience of nearly losing everything. "You know what the most remarkable thing is?" Margaret said that evening as they watched the sun set from the porch. "A year ago today, we thought we were facing the end, and now here we are, stronger than before." Thomas nodded, his hand finding hers as it had so many times through their decades together. "The Chinese have a saying that crisis is composed of 2 characters, one for danger, one for opportunity. I think I prefer the Whitfield saying," Jason remarked, joining them with Daniel asleep on his shoulder. "A good farmer knows that after the harvest comes fallow time, and after winter comes spring." Thomas looked out over the land his grandfather had purchased, his father had nurtured, and he had nearly lost. The land that would now continue under Jason's stewardship and, perhaps someday, Daniel's. The wooden sign he had carved in despair now stood as a reminder, not of defeat, but of resilience, a testament to the fact that sometimes, when all seems lost, standing firm just a little longer can make all the difference. "To spring," Thomas said simply, raising his coffee mug in a toast. "To spring," his family echoed, as the last light faded from Clearwater Farm's fields and the stars began to appear overhead. The same stars that had watched over 3 generations of Whitfields, and would now witness the 4th. In the distance, the monitoring equipment in the south pasture hummed quietly, continuing its vital work beneath the Montana sky. Some things had changed dramatically in the past year, but the most important things remained constant. The land, the legacy and the quiet pride of service without recognition. The Apache helicopter that had landed so dramatically a year ago had become part of their story now. The moment when isolation ended and hope returned. But the true miracle, Thomas reflected, wasn't in the dramatic rescue. It was in the decades of faithful stewardship that had made Clearwater Farm worth saving in the first place. And in that realization lay the lesson Thomas hoped his grandson would someday understand, that ordinary people doing extraordinary things without fanfare or recognition are the quiet foundation upon which greater stories are built. That perseverance, in the face of overwhelming odds, isn't just about winning or losing. It's about maintaining integrity when it would be easier to surrender. That sometimes standing your ground, even in a losing battle, gives others the time they need to arrive, with reinforcements you never expected. The next morning, as Thomas walked the perimeter of the south pasture in the early dawn light, the same routine his grandfather had established 70 years earlier, he spotted Daniel watching from the porch steps, his small face serious with concentration. Thomas beckoned, and the boy ran to join him, small boots kicking up dust along the path. "What are you doing, Grandpa?" Daniel asked, slipping his hand into Thomas's weathered one. "Checking the equipment," Thomas replied. "Just like my father taught me and his father taught him. Can I help?" Thomas smiled, feeling the weight of history and the promise of the future in that simple question. "I think it's about time. A fourth generation of Whitfields learned the family business," he said. "Here, let me show you." And as the sun rose over Clearwater Farm, grandfather and grandson walked the boundary of the south pasture together, the older teaching, the younger learning, continuing a tradition that had nearly been lost, but instead had been reborn, stronger, more resilient, and now secured for generations to come. In the distance, the carved wooden sign caught the early morning light, no longer a marker of defeat, but a reminder that sometimes what seems like an ending is merely the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of something even more meaningful. The Apache helicopter had been just one day in their story. The true legacy of Clearwater Farm was in all the quiet days that came before and after, the consistent, unheralded service of a family who understood that some contributions to their country would never make headlines, but were no less vital for their obscurity. And in that continuity, in that passing of knowledge and purpose from one generation to the next, lay a victory far more profound than any single dramatic rescue could ever be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.